Welcome back. I'm Pastor Mitchell, and whether you are new to APBC or you've been around for a while, I want to say thanks for watching today. You know, as a church, we exist to lead people to trust in and follow Jesus, and we do that by creating opportunities and environments for you to connect with God, with other people, and with the world. Some of those key opportunities are highlighted on the front end of this video. Some of them you'll find on our Facebook page, but wherever you're at in your faith journey, we hope that you find a way to engage with what we are doing as a church. And if at any time you have any questions about faith or what we do together, simply drop me an email at mitchell.deware@gmail.com, and I would love to be able to connect with you. Now, I hope that today's message both encourages and inspires you in taking your next step in trusting in and following Jesus. So we're in part 9, as I say, of our series Good News, and today we've called the message Question Periods. I usually don't draw too much attention to titles, but kind of serves as a good segue. I don't know if you've ever watched Question Periods on the parliamentary proceedings online. You can watch the House of Commons. I rarely ever tune into that except when I'm flipping through channels, and that's only for about 30 seconds. But maybe you found your spot, or found yourself in a spot where you've been kind of responding to questions from people, or maybe you've been one person asking the questions. Either way, whether it's been a job interview, you've kind of been the center of attention for questions, or maybe it's been something else. As I was preparing for this morning, my brain kind of wandered back. I think it was to 2007 when I found myself in a similar situation, although it was on purpose. So within our Baptist convention, we are about 450 churches throughout the Atlantic provinces that are kind of bound together through associations, through agreement and participation, and then the wider convention. And so we can do things together as that many churches that we really can't do separately. And so being part of that family of Baptist churches in terms of our convention is kind of a big deal. But in the process of that, for pastors and for clergy to be recognized as ordained and that comes with certain things in order to be ordained and to have your ordination recognized, to be able to do what I do. There are a variety of steps to go through to get there, and I won't kind of bore you with the whole process this morning, but suffice to say that I couldn't just go to school and take a course or two and then do what I do and have that recognized by our convention. And so there's a bunch of meetings and papers and stuff to do. And so by the time you get to the last step, you appear before what's called the examining council, which sounds scary enough as it is, right? And so what happens is you submit a paper of about 2,500 words outlining your own testimony, your call to ministry, kind of your statement of doctrine, and you submit that, and then you're called to a series or to a meeting. And when it was my turn, the time when I did it, I walked into the room, and in the room at the table at the front is a seat for me, a seat for the chief examiner, and then there's 2 or 3 other people up there kind of taking minutes and notes and stuff. And then in front of me in the room is about 50 different people, pastors, professors from university, from the Divinity College. There's even a small gallery for people who just want to show up and watch for whatever reason. Maybe it's family or friends that have come to kind of see and, kind of encourage and support and that kind of stuff. There are a few seats for that. But you walk into the room, and for about the first 20 to 25 minutes, you get asked questions based on doctrine, ministry practice, all kinds of things I get asked that I respond to the whole room. And then after those 20 to 25 minutes, there's another 20 to 30 minutes of questions from the group of about 50 people in front of you about your theological stance, something that you wrote here, something you said over here, follow-up questions to your actual live answers. And then after all that's over, they all get together and, pray through, decide through, are we ready to kind of approve this person as a candidate for ordained ministry? And so it can be a nerve-wracking process, if you can imagine. And so in seminary, we had this class that kind of helped prepare us for that moment. And I recall sitting in the class and our professor saying, listen, you're writing your papers, you're kind of getting all that stuff in order for getting that off to the examining council. He said, now, I just want to tell you up front that most people dread this process. Most people don't like to sit in front of a room of that many people and answer questions on a paper they submitted, and, it could be anything, right? And it's really not, for some, he says, they enjoy it. There's some people who look forward to it. There's some who really enjoy the theological discussion, that they feel confident about what they have prepared, that, it's one of those things that, they're ready for, and they feel like, hey, I got a good grasp on this. I think I know what we're, and I'm sitting there in the room going, yeah, I don't see it as that intimidating. Like, I'm kind of looking forward to the theological discussion and all the rest. And then my professor says, and those people are really sick people, he said. And I'm going, oh, man. And so in that moment, I'm just like, oh, maybe I should kind of dial this back a bit and maybe be a little more nervous. So I get into the room, just by way of note. When I first walked in and sat down, I figured I'd pour myself a glass of water, and my hands were going like this as I was trying to pour it in. So the nerves were there. They did slowly disappear through the course of the conversation, but it's one of those situations where you're put in front of a bunch of people, and man, the questions are coming, and that's kind of what happens to Jesus in some, if we can compare it in any way, but he finds himself in what we're going to cover today, kind of on the receiving end of a whole bunch of questions from various groups of people about theology, about taxes, about all kinds of stuff, and Jesus is put on the spot where he's being requested to give an answer. And so if we recall last week, we followed Jesus into the city of Jerusalem on a donkey, and he rides right into the temple, and there should have been a welcome to receive him, and there wasn't. And so he left the city for the night. And now we pick up the story in Mark chapter 11, the day after those events, and Jesus comes into the city and straight into the temple. And what he does next when he gets there is absolutely shocking. It is incredibly disruptive, and it actually further intensifies the resolve of the chief priests and the scribes and the religious leaders to actually have Jesus destroyed. So here's where we pick up what happens. Chapter 11, verse 15, it says, and they, meaning Jesus and his disciples, came to Jerusalem. And he entered the temple, and he began to drive out those who sold and who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. Now, if you can imagine, this is an absolutely disruptive scene, right? I don't know when the last time you saw somebody flip over a table was, but this is something that Jesus walks into the temple and does. Now, we got to remember that this is the few days leading into the celebration of Passover, which is like one of the high points in the Jewish calendar, right? Like this is, if not the high point in the Jewish annual calendar of things that would happen. So there is people coming into the city of Jerusalem, not only from all over the nation of Israel, but from other nations of the world as well. And it's said that the population in Jerusalem during Passover inflated immensely, sometimes 10 times as many people, as would normally be in the city, even bigger than that. There are a lot of people in the city for this event. And they're coming from all over to worship. And the fact of the matter is that when people would come from far distances to worship at the temple, because in that day, part of the worship included offering sacrifices, what would happen is that instead of bringing a lamb or bringing the animal with them from far, far away, they would, fly into Jerusalem, as it were, and they would purchase what was needed for the sacrifice when they got there. And so that was part of what people did when they got to the city. Instead of bringing their own, they just picked one up and then brought it to the temple, and that was part of how everything worked. Now, it's fascinating, the details that Mark gives us, because I think they're incredibly important for helping us understand what's going on. Two things in particular that get mentioned that I think are helpful for us. One is that Jesus overturns the tables of the money changers. So that should tip off to us or signify to us something going on about financial transactions happening within the temple, right? And so again, you've got people coming from different places with different currencies, and so we want to have, the ability to transfer our currency to, we have the right kind of currency to be able to pay for what we need to, right? And so it's just kind of like going to the States with, Canadian dollars, right? We showed up in Florida one time, many years ago, it seems, and we showed up in Florida, and someone that I was with went to pay for something, and they pulled out a $50 bill, and the person behind the cash looked at them and said, "What is that?" And he said, "It's $50. And I looked at the person and said, "Look, don't forget we're in the States, your Canadian currency isn't going to work here." And she said, "Oh yeah, right. But then the guy was so fascinated because we had red money. Like, who has red money, right? So anyway, that's a whole side story. But Jesus, here, with the money changers, what's happening is that they're converting the currency, and the understanding is that they're charging high interest rates on the conversion of currency. Right? And so what's happening is people are coming to get their money converted, and there are people sitting at the table profiting off of the conversion of currency so that they can then buy what they need. And not only that, but he flips over not only the tables, but also the seats of the people who sold what? Pigeons. Doves, right? The small birds, which again should give us an indication about something specific, right? What's happening with the pigeons or the doves? Well, there's provision in the law because the sacrifice that was required or that was usually brought was a lamb. But if you could not afford a lamb because you were poor, right? You didn't have the financial means, then you could bring doves. You could bring turtle doves or pigeons, right? That could be the offering that is made at the temple instead of the lamb. And so there's provision for the poor. And what Jesus is doing is turning over the tables of the money changers who are charging high interest and the seats of those who are selling pigeons, presumably again, to those who are poor, right? And saying, look, the temple itself and those functioning within the temple and the business of the temple at the moment is actually ripping people off. And so Jesus then says this in verse 17. He says, he was teaching them saying, "Is it not written, my house shall be called a what? House of prayer for the nations," that people could come from all over, right? You don't have to be from Israel. You can come from all over the world to pray and for this to be a house of prayer. But he says, you have made it a den of not business, of robbers, that you're ripping people off, that there's thievery happening, that the interest rates are high and the poor are being oppressed. Now listen, this is a throwback to Isaiah chapter 56, verse 7, which is all about justice and covenant observance. What Jesus, in his designating the temple as a house of prayer, you can go back to Isaiah 56 and read about this. And Isaiah is speaking about the importance of justice and covenant observance, observing the covenant between God and people in the worship and the function of the temple, and particularly among people. And so Jesus says, look, this is supposed to be a house of prayer, but you have turned it into a den of robbers, again, referencing back to now Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 11 specifically, but the whole context of that is Jeremiah giving an indictment against Judah, the region, right, for oppression and injustice happening. And so Jeremiah is calling out the group of Judah saying, hey, no oppression, no injustice. These things shouldn't be happening. We shouldn't be ripping people off. Particularly the poor should be looked after here. And so Jesus now comes in and says, look, this is not what it's supposed to be. Okay, so we can think, and this has been said many times through history, even to today, that this passage is really about prohibiting selling things within the church building, which I don't think that's the primary push here. That's not really Jesus' agenda. It seems that he's more concerned about the high interest and the ripping off of the poor and profiteering off of religious services. That seems to be more the thrust of what he's talking about, right? And so now Jesus begins, and this starts here, he begins a series of indictments or of criticisms of the function of the temple and of the priests during that day. This whole thing kind of kicks off that whole conversation, and we're going to see that over and over and over again till we get to the end of Mark's gospel. So with all that as an aside, so Jesus comes into the temple, causes a huge disruption. There's all this that takes place, and so he and the disciples eventually leave for the night again. So then they come back now into the city the next day. So this is the third day in a row he's come back into the city of Jerusalem, and when they return in the morning, the chief priests and the scribes and the elders are all there waiting for him. And so this is now on purpose. This is now something that's happening. There's been backroom conversations about what's going down. There's been talk back and forth here and there about, oh, hey, did you see what happened? We got to deal with this. We don't like it. And so it's a small group of people or a group and a small crowd, right? And this is what happens. Small group, small crowd, get together, right? There's competing desires, and then one group plots the destruction of the other group, right? We just want to get them destroyed. And we got to deal with this and clear the house. And so this is what's going on. So now Jesus comes back into Jerusalem, third day in a row. He comes into the temple again. In verse 27, we read who is there waiting for him. It says they came into Jerusalem, and as he was walking in the temple, the chief priests and the scribes and the elders came to him, and they said to him, so they've got a question. The religious leaders, the teachers, the aristocracy, there's a whole delegation together as a group that come and approach Jesus. Right? Again, this is on purpose. This is not kind of a random pulling together of people in the moment. This is, we are here waiting for him to show up so that we can, do our thing. Verse 28, and they said to him, by what authority are you doing these things? Or who gave you this authority to do them? Who gave you the right to make decisions and to take action and to do the things you're doing? And specifically, these things is about the things he did the day before. Who told you could turn the tables over? Who told you could drive out the animals? Who told you can cause this commotion? Who told you could criticize the temple in this way? And so they ask him this question, and they're really putting the pressure on Jesus about the ruckus that he caused the day before. And let's be honest, they're pretty clear themselves that it wasn't us who gave you that authority. And so unless there's someone higher than you can think of that gave you that authority, we are the power brokers here. We're the people in charge. We're the people with the responsibility. And listen, he's certainly not acting on their authority. Here's how the conversation goes down. Who gave you this authority is their question. And then Jesus responds in this way. It's fascinating. He said, I'm going to ask you a question. And if you answer me, I will tell you by what authority I do these things. So listen, I'm going to ask you a question. So you answer mine, and then I'll answer yours. He says, was the baptism of John from heaven or from man? Answer me. He says, let's go back to the Jordan River a few years ago. John's down there baptizing people. People are coming out to the river, confessing their sin, right? I've extorted people. I've ripped people off, right? All their sins. They're confessing their sin. And John says, you got to get ready because God's about to do something incredible in our midst. Confess your sin. Get your heart ready. And so he's baptizing people in the Jordan River as a sign or as a symbol of their repentance from their sin, right? And they're preparing their heart and being ready for the thing that God is about to do. And so he says, when John was down at the river doing those things, he says, did John's authority come from heaven, in other words, from God, or from human beings? And kind of tied into that from you all as the religious leaders of the day, right? And so whose authority did it come from? Well, they decide we got to have a group huddle. So they pull everybody together. Well, I don't know. What do you think? What do you think? And Jesus is there waiting for their answer, but they started to discuss it among themselves. And they said this, if we say that John got his authority from heaven, then Jesus will say, then why didn't you believe him? Which makes sense, right? Because when they went out to see John, they didn't believe. They weren't baptized. They didn't repent of anything. They just said, this is ridiculous, and then left and went back. We're not going to pay any attention to this. So they say, well, look, if we say it was from God, then why didn't we confess our sin? But they said, should we say that it came from human beings? And they were afraid of the people because everybody thought that John really was a prophet. So if we say one thing from heaven, then Jesus is going to say, why didn't you believe him? We'll look like a fool. But if we say, well, it was from man, we can't say that, right? Because the people will then say, well, John was a prophet. Why didn't you believe John? And then the people will be mad at us. So we're kind of stuck here. We're not sure what the answer is going to be. And so they say to Jesus, we do not know. We can't answer your question. And Jesus simply looks at them and says, then neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. I'm not going to tell you who gave me the authority to do what I did the day before. In fact, the implication, which we should pick up on, is that in answering Jesus' question, they would have the answer to their question. Right? If John's authority came from God, Jesus is simply implying that my source of authority is the same as John's. It is from heaven. And their refusal to answer is a refusal to acknowledge, but Jesus isn't done yet. He's got more to say to them. In fact, he tells a parable that immediately after this that does not sit well with them because they know the parable he's telling is about them. And so he says this. He says, So he says, listen, chapter 12, verse 1. And he began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard and put a fence around it and dug a pit. So he tells the story about a guy who owns a property and he's going to plant a vineyard. Right? And he digs a pit and he builds a tower and he cares for it and he gets everything all cultivated and he's got everything in rows and, he's put time, investment, energy, all kinds of stuff into building this vineyard. And what he does, once the vineyard is completed and things start growing, is he leases it out to tenants. He leases it out to people to look after the vineyard and he goes away on a long trip. Well, when the time came for the fruit to be matured and to be harvested, he sent a servant to come and get some of the fruit. Well, in doing so, they saw the servant coming and they said, we don't want to give that up. And so they beat that servant, right, and sent him back. Well, the guy comes back to the owner of the vineyard and says, this is what they've done to me. And he says, well, that's not right. So he sends another servant. Maybe they'll listen to him. But this servant, instead of beating, they put to death. And so he never hears back. And so he sends another. And he keeps sending all these servants, and some they beat, and some they killed, Jesus says. And eventually, the owner of the vineyard said, I know what I'll do. I will send my son. Surely they will listen to my son. And so the owner of the vineyard sends his son. And they take that son when they see him, and they say, hey, if we kill him, we'll own the vineyard. That's what we can do. And so they took him and they threw him outside of the vineyard and they killed him. And what will the owner of the vineyard do, Jesus says? He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to someone else. He's going to remove it. And he's going to give the vineyard to someone else. And so this is the story. Now they know that Jesus is talking about them. They're the tenants in the story. They're supposed to be collecting the fruit and giving it to the owner of the vineyard, who's God himself. And God, Jesus says, has now sent his son. Will they believe him? Will they listen to him? And in fact, what's happening is they're not listening to Jesus. And again, this just embroils the conversation even more. In verse 12, at the end of that whole thing, it says this, and they were seeking to arrest him, but feared the people, for they perceived that he had told the parable against them. So they understand. They get it, but they're afraid of the response of the people if they do something to Jesus right away. So they just simply leave to regroup, and they're going to circle back around it again. Now, it's fascinating because what happens next, all on the same day, by the way, are 3 successive conversations that Jesus has with different groups, with different agendas and different questions and different things that they want him to address. So again, on the hot seat, one thing right after another. And so they're trying to trap Jesus in his words so they can accuse him of speaking against Moses and against the scriptures and against the law. If they can even get him to misspeak in one word, in one instance, in one moment, they will take that and run with it and hold it up as the example of this is why we should not believe him. This is why he needs to be destroyed. This is why he should be condemned. And so they're looking for a reason to arrest Jesus. And here's the conversations that follow. The first you might be familiar with. It says, and they sent to him. So again, same delegation, religious leaders, scribes, right? Pharisees, the ones who had kind of conspired together. And as soon as Jesus entered the temple, they pounced and said, hey, tell us, answer this question for us. they conspired together and they sent some of the Pharisees and of the Herodians to trap Jesus in his talk. Now, let's be clear about this designation of the two groups of people. Okay? The Pharisees, of course, a religious sect in Jerusalem, right? In Israel, for that matter, but a religious sect, strict observance to Jewish law, right? And with them, a group of Herodians, whose root is Herod, who is the king of Israel, who is allied with Rome, who's occupying Israel. So we have one group of religion and politics together to confront Jesus. Now, you know how this plays out at Thanksgiving and Christmas conversations, right? Religion and politics, this comes like sometimes, not for all of us, but for some of us, those are the conversations we try to avoid in social settings where we all just want to get along, right? And now they send this unified group to Jesus to ask him a question. There's their obvious interests that are divided between them, right? But they come to Jesus. Now it's fascinating, if you go back to Mark chapter 3, verse 6, that way back in the beginning, early on in Jesus' ministry, when the Pharisees were ticked off at Jesus about something, it says they went and plotted with the Herodians about how they might destroy him. And now their plot is being hatched. And so they come to Jesus and they just start by buttering him up. Hey, teacher, we know that you are true and you don't care about anyone's opinion. Now, just listen to this language, okay? For you are not swayed by appearances, as they stand there in front of him with their designations and robes and everything else, right? But you truly teach the way of God. In other words, we're counting on you to shoot straight with us and to tell us the truth. All right? Here we are together. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or should we not pay them? Now, again, clear from the text, clear from the history, is this, that the Jewish people did not like paying taxes to Rome. Right? And specifically, the word that's used for paying taxes here in the Greek is a reference to the head tax or to the census tax, which was specifically about who was under the authority of Rome. So this isn't just like pay your taxes because, it's general taxes. This is like a designation of Rome's control and authority over you. And that's the tax you're required to pay. It's the census tax. And so the question is, right? And by the way, there's significant opposition to this in Israel in that day. Let's be clear about that. There's actually been documented revolts against this, campaigning about this. We shouldn't have to pay taxes to Rome. We are God's people. We are, all of this kind of stuff. So should we pay taxes or not? And now we have the Herodians who are expecting him to say yes, because if they say no, then if Jesus says no, then clearly they're out to get him. But if he says no, you shouldn't pay or if you say yes, you should pay taxes, then the Pharisees are going to be upset. So again, kind of a no-win here, right? There's no easy way out of this one. And so they're asking him, tell us where your true allegiance lies. Is your true allegiance with God or with people, since we're on that topic of conversation, right? And so Jesus says to them, look, does anybody have a coin, right? Like, why are you trying to test me? Bring me a coin and let me see it. And when they brought him one, he said, whose likeness and whose inscription is this? Well, whose inscription is on the coin? Whose image is on the coin? Caesar's, right? It's Caesar's head on the back of the coin, right? That's what it is. And he says to them, listen, give to Caesar or render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and then give to God the things that are God's. Right? And so what's he saying? Look, be subject to Caesar's authority. If it's Caesar's image on the coin, then pay your taxes. Right? Like if that's what is expected as, someone under the authority of the Roman Empire, then pay your taxes. But he says, but then give to God what is God's. Implication, whose image does every single human being bear? God's. Aren't we all made in the image of God? Isn't every single person made in the image of God? Yes, absolutely they are. Albeit broken, albeit marred somehow, albeit, dysfunctional because of sin, but we are all made in the image of God. And so Jesus is saying, look, as an image bearer of God, be subject to God's authority over all things. Absolutely, but give to Caesar what Caesar's and give to God what's God's. And everybody marveled at his answer, because nobody could find any reason to accuse him. Then another group comes along, the Sadducees, and they say, teacher, we have a question for you as well. And Mark tells us this interesting piece. He says the Sadducees come, and by the way, the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection. They don't believe that people are raised from the dead. Okay, that's part of their doctrinal statement. We don't believe there's a resurrection. There's not going to be a resurrection. People aren't raised from the dead. This is just our theological conviction, right? It's a religious sect within Judaism who only believes the scriptures are the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy, the law or the history and the prophets. I mean, those things are helpful and they're okay, but they're not really scripture. And so this is their view of things, but there's no resurrection. And I've said this before, but that's why they're Sadducees, because that's why they're so sad. Do you see? Because there's no resurrection hope someday, right? And so it's just, sorry. So they disagree with Jesus' view from the get-go. Right from the outset, we know that there's a theological tension here, right? And so they say to him, teacher, here's what Moses said. And so they ask him a question, which is really a hypothetical question, and more of a riddle, I guess, based on an Old Testament law called the law of levirate marriage, whereby if a woman has a husband and he dies, but she has no children, right? Then his brother could then marry her to provide children and an heir so that the family line could continue, right? And so they come to him and they say, look, here's our question. A woman had a husband, but they had no children, and then he died. So, according to the law, his brother then married her, but then he died before they could have children as well. So the next brother in line married her, but then he died before they could have children. And on it goes. And by the time you're the 4th or 5th brother in line, you're thinking, I don't know if I want to marry this woman because all my brothers died before. Like, what's going on here? And so now they come through and they say there were 7 brothers and all 7 of them married her and they all died and there were no children, right? And so they go through this whole thing, and then they say this, in the resurrection, which they didn't believe in, again, remember, when people rise again, whose wife will she be because she had 7 husbands? So at the end of the day, when this is all over with, right, whose wife is she going to be? Now, I don't think they're genuinely interested in an answer. They're just trying to prove a point, which you've had that experience before too, right? When someone asks you a question, right? And so Jesus says to them, is this not the reason you are wrong? Just right out of the gate, right? Isn't this why you're wrong? Because, he says, you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God, which is a highly offensive statement, by the way. You who propose to teach the law don't even know the Bible. Right? You don't know, and worse off, you don't know the power of God. And then he answers in some form. He says, for when they rise from the dead, statement, people will be resurrected, by the way, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like the angels in heaven. And so Jesus says, look, at the end of the day, when people are resurrected, nobody's going to be having kids at that point. So let's just kind of settle that in our minds. Nobody's going to be having kids. Marriage isn't really a thing at that point. And by the way, as well, Sadducees also, as a minor theological point, just didn't believe the angels even existed. And so Jesus is just kind of sticking it a bit more by saying at the resurrection, they're going to be like the angels in heaven. And so, as far as the dead being raised, Jesus says, let's go back to kind of the original point and the more important point. He says, have you not read in the book of Moses, which is their scriptures, right? In the passage about the bush, how God spoke to Moses saying, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. He is not God of the dead, but of the living, and you are quite wrong. Just straight out. Like, you got it wrong, guys. Like, this is not what's going on here. And so he doesn't hold back. Like, there's no ambiguity. And so finally, one of the scribes came up because he'd kind of been passing by and heard the conversations happening and saw an opportunity to ask his question. So we don't think that this question is kind of trying to trap Jesus. He's not part of the plot in any way, but he just simply says, hey, Jesus, which commandment is the most important of all? You add up all 600 and however many commandments there are in the law of God, all those commandments that we have, which one is the most important? If we were to kind of raise one to the top, if there was one that was weightiest, if there was one that we should pay the most attention to, which is it? And Jesus answers by quoting Deuteronomy chapter 6. He says, the most important is this, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. The most important thing of all of the commandments, the most important is that you love God with the totality of who you are. And the second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. And the guy that asked the question simply says, you're right. You are absolutely right, Jesus. That would have been my answer. I think the scripture you quoted is exactly it. And that is more important, he says, than any burnt offering or sacrifice that we could ever give. And when Jesus saw that he had answered wisely, he said to him, you are not far from the kingdom of God. And after that, no one dared ask him any more questions. Mark simply tells us that everybody realizes that Jesus is not going to get tripped up. He's not going to be outsmarted. There's not going to be anybody who's going to put Jesus on the spot and catch him in a word that's going to be able to condemn him. And so nobody wants to kind of run that circle again. Oh, they're not done yet. But no one at this point has ever dared to ask Jesus any more questions. And the whole thing is they're trying, again, to catch Jesus in a misspeech, in contradicting the law, and all of those attempts had failed, and question period was over, but their attempt to destroy him was not over. But listen, in the midst of all of these things, right, we see the conflict continue to escalate because we've got a group that's out for blood against Jesus, and they're trying to trap him, and they're unable to. And so last week when we talked about Jesus entering into the city of Jerusalem, we talked about him entering as king, right? Riding into Jerusalem on the donkey. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. He enters into as king, who's ushering in the kingdom of God. Right? And today, and through all of these things in chapter 11 into chapter 12, what we see is Jesus as lawgiver. Jesus who is interpreting the law, and not only does he interpret the law and explain the law, but he summarizes it in this way. He says, it's all who you love. At the end of the day, when you take all of this and you summarize it in the one kind of most important thing, in fact, the two that go together because you really can't have one without the other. The one flows into the other. If you love God and love others, it's all about who you love. Every law here was intended to be about how we love other people. That's what it's about, and that's how he summarizes it. And listen, for us, right, what's the most important thing? The most important thing is that we get our relationship with God in order. In fact, we might even say that we allow God to get our relationship with him in order. Right? That our love for him stems out of his great love toward us. And if our chief purpose as human beings is to love our Maker and our Creator, then every other aspect of life should be oriented around that one thing. Right? That every decision we make, every relationship we have, every kind of priority that we set ought to surround how can I love God with all my heart, with all my soul, with all my mind, with all my strength. It should define every single allegiance that we have. And secondly, is it is important that we love others, Jesus says, even as you would love yourself. That you would give the same level of attention to another human being that you give to yourself. And man, like that is not always easy to do, is it? Because it rarely happens on our own time frame and our own agenda and when we want it to happen, right? Given that level of attention to someone else has to happen probably outside of the designated slot that we want it to happen in. But that's the thrust of the statement. And that may require of us setting aside our own rights and our own desires and our own kind of motivations for things so that we might seek the good of someone else. What's the most important thing? How can we summarize it all? That we love God and that we love others in the same way that we would love ourselves. And when our laws or our traditions or our, whatever you want to call them, get in the way and trump what love requires of us, we need to reevaluate according to what Jesus commands. In fact, John put it this way in 1 John chapter 4, starting at verse 7. He says, "Beloved, let us," in other words, those of us loved by God, beloved, "let us love one another, for love is from God. And whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. In this, the love of God was made manifest or shown among us, that God sent his only Son into the world that we might live through him. And in this is love, not that we have loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation or necessary sacrifice for our sins. Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God abides in us and his love is perfected